Hello, this lecture is about academic communication and it's part of the How to Succeed as a Student series of short videos. The purpose of this video is to help you to understand how to communicate appropriately in academic settings. We're going to look at some of the characteristics of what makes up good academic communication, both in verbal and written media. We're going to think a little bit about the separation and overlap of personal communication, public communication, and academic communication methods. And we're going to look very briefly at academic writing, email, blogs, and presentations with a few tips and tricks for how to engage productively in these methods of communication. Why are we going to do this? Well, obviously, academic communication is a huge part of your university study. Almost all the assessments you hand in will involve some sort of academic communication, from a written assignment, which is almost entirely academic communication, through to reflecting on a piece of practice, where it might be less formal. So I'm hoping that this video will help you communicate appropriately in these different academic contexts. And this in turn will help you to do better at assignments, better working in teams, better at managing your work. Finally, good communication skills are absolutely crucial and highly transferable skills, which you will take from university into the rest of your life. Okay, let's start with academic writing. So I'd like you to just pause the video and take a couple of minutes or seconds to think about what some of the differences between academic writing and other forms of writing you may have done in the past. So pause the video now. Okay, we're going to continue. Academic writing has the following characteristics. It's formal. It has a formal style. It's accurate. Unlike some other forms of writing, academic writing is really defined by its accuracy. It's analytical. You're not just describing something, you're not just describing an event or a piece of knowledge, you're actually analysing it. And it's explicitly evidenced so that the reader can tell that your analysis, firstly, that the writing itself is accurate, and also that your analysis is based in existing knowledge, is substantiated by the knowledge around us. It's properly referenced, and that helps with the evidencing of the work, and it's also a feature of crediting other people for the work of theirs that they've used in your work. Academic writing is also well structured. It needs to lead the reader through a topic in pursuit of a logical conclusion at the end. And academic writing is often persuasive. Now, it often doesn't set out to be persuasive. It's not like writing a magazine advert, for instance. But good academic writing tends to be persuasive because of the accuracy and the wealth of evidence and the quality of the analysis that you've used. So academic writing is often very persuasive. And finally, it's normally very clearly structured with subheadings, things like introduction, conclusion, reference list. So you are explicitly structuring your writing by the use of subheadings. What does good academic writing look like? Well, that's a big question. It very much depends what field you're in and what type of sources you're looking at. There's a big variety in good academic writing. But generally, you will find that good academic writing has an element of comparing and contrasting different authors, different theories, different conceptual frameworks, different starting positions. Generally, good academic writing will have some sort of formulation and justification of a personal view. The author will be expressing their own position on a topic in relation to the existing knowledge. And this means that there often isn't a single right answer. Academic writing is much more about the argument, the formulation of a position, rather than there being a simple and perhaps shallow correct answer. That's quite rare in academic writing. So the best way to find out what academic writing looks like is to simply look at some. You will be reading anyway for your course. You'll be asked to do complementary readings, whatever course you're on. So have a look at academic writing and what does it look like from your perspective. And then when you're familiar with what academic writing looks like, you'll be trying to emulate that style in your own essays, your own reflections, your own chapters, whatever it is that you're writing. So just a word of warning here. Make sure that when you're doing academic writing that you've read and understood the assignment brief. If the question says compare and contrast, make sure that you compare and contrast. If the question says interpret, make sure that you're interpreting. So you need to look carefully at the question that you've been given in an assignment to decide how you're going to answer it. If it simply says describe, then you're fine with just description. But do make sure that you understand the question that's being asked and that you actually address this question in the work that you hand in. So do make sure that you're doing what your tutors are asking you to do. We're going to talk briefly now about email. Email is more of an organizational tool than formal academic communication. However, there are a few things to note here. Sometimes email from Canvas or from GSA ends up in a spam folder. Please set up your email to make sure that this is not happening. And when you get these emails, please do actually read them. You can miss a lot of really good opportunities if you don't fully engage with the emails that are coming from GSA. And this is something as simple as the venue of a class has changed, but it can also be opportunities for training or opportunities for skills development that you would otherwise miss. When you email your tutor, please email from your GSA email address through Canvas or directly to their GSA email address. It's important that you don't use a personal email address when you're emailing your tutor. Tutors do aim to respond to emails in a timely fashion. Roughly 2 days is recommended, but remember that that's 2 working days, and you must take account of the fact that not all tutors work full time. You can't expect responses outside of working hours, and occasionally your tutors may be away on holiday or at things like conferences, so do try and bear in mind that they have other things to do as well. Please don't email your tutor without first trying to answer the question yourself. This is mostly a logistical issue. You might wait 2 days just to find that your tutor gives you a link to Canvas and you could have found that out 2 days ago. But also, trying to seek out the information yourself helps you practice the research skills that were covered in a different one of these videos. Now on to social media. Now, social media is very, very complex. You will be already using it for a wide variety of different purposes. And if we look at how social media overlaps, we can see here that there's a lot of different areas and different audiences for the different social media that you use. You have here a huge public sphere that some of your social media may overlap into, Twitter, for example. You also have perhaps family groups, friend groups, groups within groups, and you might have some social media related to interest groups. You might be on a mailing list for skiing or something. Whatever it is, a lot of these things overlap. And if we look now at academic communication, we can see that that fits into this overall picture of social media. And some academic communication may overlap with interest groups, it may overlap with friend groups, it may overlap with the public sphere, or like this one, it might be completely private. The point here is to make sure that you know which of these areas your posts are ending up in. So I'd just like you to make sure that you know who's reading your social media posts. On to reflective blogs now. Now, a common tool for personal and professional development, especially in the arts, is reflection. Now, it depends what course you're on, but you may well be asked to do formal reflection as part of an assessment. This could be in the form of a blog, it could be in the form of a zine, or a single standalone piece of written work that you hand in after a piece of practice. It really depends which course you're on. However, I'm going to talk a little bit about reflective blogs as an example of self-reflection. So, descriptive writing is something that tells the story. It tells the story of something from one viewpoint normally in the sequence that it happened, with very little or no reflection on the meaning and impact of what actually happened. If you're starting to reflect, then what you're doing is adding to that descriptive account some elements of why. Why did this happen? What was the meaning of that? What was the impact of that? So it starts to add questions into the descriptive account. And then if you move to fully reflective writing, then you're starting to include external information, the kind of citations that we've talked about before, the evidence for your position. It also includes some inward looking questioning of why you did something in a certain way. What was your motivation? And this reflection is expressed in a clear and meaningful way to the readers to add value to your submission. Critical self-reflection really requires you to step back from the learning experience. It asks you to look at it from the outside and engage in deep learning related to the event or the activity that took place. And this enhances your learning. It makes it much more meaningful. So it's encouraged that you develop self-reflection in your thinking, but also in your writing. So there's lots of guidance coming up on how to do this, but very briefly, some questions you can ask are, what did I learn? How did that make me feel? How could I apply this to a different assignment, to my life outside university, to a different project, to a different medium? What were the barriers to learning and how did you overcome them? So there's a lot more information in this leaflet, which I've linked here, which talks very briefly about self-reflection. Now, if you are asked to produce a reflective blog for your course, then please be aware that your tutors will be actively looking at it if it forms part of your assessment. Your classmates will also probably be looking at it. So make sure that you write and comment on other people's blogs, if that's something you're being asked to do, in an academic style. It may seem that because it's a blog, it's an informal communication channel, but if it forms part of your university work, then it should be considered to be academic writing in the same way that an essay would. So make sure it's fair and balanced. If you're giving others feedback, make sure it's constructive. Make sure everything you say is well substantiated with links, references to the evidence that you've used. Make sure that it's reflective and analytical. Do make sure that your blog and the comments are suitable for public viewing, even if at this time they're not actually public. You can also use reflective blogs to help you plan your learning. You can reflect back on what you've already done, but you can also really take this reflection and use it to plan your future learning in the ways described in the first video in this series on personal and professional development. So I've included here 2 templates which are available at this Padlet. One is for a less structured blog entry and one is for a much more structured entry. So have a look at those and see if they help you to develop this reflective way of thinking and this reflective way of writing. Moving on now to presentations. You will almost certainly at some point in your university career be asked to stand up and do a presentation, whether that is online during the pandemic or face-to-face. So we're going to talk briefly then about presentations. So when you're planning your presentation, there are 4 main steps. What do you want to say? What do you need to say? Why do you want or need to say it? Who are you saying it to? Who do you need to be there? Who might be there? And of course, how much time do you have for the presentation? So the what do you want to say part, that is the topic of your presentation, and it's generally quite easy. It might have been given to you as an assignment, or it might be something you've selected yourself, but it's generally very easy to decide. The aim, why do you need to say it? That's slightly more complex, and that can be summed up in the question, what do I want to achieve? Or you can use this sentence, fill in the rest of this sentence, by the end of my talk, the audience will. So if we look a bit more closely about topic and aim then, through 2 examples, let's say that you've been asked to present on a piece of software that you like in your practice, perhaps a digital painting piece of software. So you've chosen a piece of software. The topic is simply the software that you've chosen. The aim here is to describe and inform. So at the end of my talk, the audience will understand the features of this software and know a little bit about how to use it, for example. Example 2 is a bit more complex. Suppose you've been asked to do a presentation on the negative impact of globalization on developing countries. The topic here is globalization, but your aim is to persuade the audience. So by the end of my talk, the audience will believe, based on the evidence, that globalization has a negative impact on developing countries. So that was kind of given to you in the assignment, but at the same time, how you approach that aim is very much up to you. So thinking again about the audience then, communication is a two-way process. The audience needs to understand what you say, and they also need to connect to the way the topic is presented. So how does then the type of audience that you have affect both what and how you communicate? I'd like you to pause the video again and just jot down 2 things about how the audience affects your communication with them. Pause the video now. Okay, we're going to continue. So here are some of my suggestions for how the audience affects an academic presentation. Who is listening? Who's going to be in your audience? What's their age? It's very different presenting to children than it is to adults. What's their level of education? How much do you need to explain, or how much knowledge can you assume is already there? What's their relationship to you? Are they your tutors? Are they your peers? Are they strangers? Does anyone in the audience have any particular needs? For example, perhaps not everyone in your audience is a native English speaker. This might need you to slow down in your delivery. Also, the time of day. I've found that if you're presenting right after lunch, your audience tends to be a lot more sleepy. So when you're preparing your content, you can predict the audience background knowledge using some of these characteristics. But you must also remember that your audience is there because they want to learn something. They want new knowledge from you and from your presentation. So you've got to make it interesting. And consider then, are you going to produce a brief summary of what the audience might already know in order to make sure that people in the room who don't have that background knowledge can quickly catch up, and then you can continue with your presentation at the level that you want it to be at? In terms of language and style then, you need your audience to understand any technical language, particularly acronyms or jargon that seem very natural to somebody who's been in a field for a long time will leave an audience perplexed. So make sure if you're using technical language or acronyms that you explain them as if to a member of the general public. The worst that happens here is you've wasted 3 seconds saying something out loud that everybody already knew. The style of a presentation should be somewhat formal. It is an academic presentation, so there is an expectation of some formality. But as you'll know, there's a balance to be struck here. Somebody who's very engaging tends to break some of the rules of formality to engage with their audience. And if somebody simply reads a very formal piece of writing with no eye contact with the audience, as you know, that's quite difficult to listen to. So make sure that your delivery is clear, that your words are understandable, and that you're teaching your audience something that they didn't already know. So define what you want your audience to learn, what's relevant to them. And this is important. This is why understanding your audience is a crucial part of doing a presentation. It's all very well telling them new things, but unless those new things are relevant to them and their lives, you'll struggle to maintain interest. So some tips for presentation then. Ask questions designed to get a verbal response from your audience. This can be a little bit daunting because you're passing over control from the speaker to the audience, and you need to be very careful about time management if you're going to ask somebody in your audience to comment on something. So it's up to you how you manage this. But a good way of doing something is to ask for a quick show of hands in response to a question. This means that you maintain control over the pacing of your presentation, but you also get some feedback from your audience, and they get to move around a little bit, which keeps them interested and awake. You could try giving your audience time to talk to each other. Again, this is a risky tactic if you're in a time-limited presentation, and I wouldn't recommend this for a 5-minute presentation, for example. But if you're in a situation where you have half an hour to communicate an idea to a group, it's a really good idea to let your audience talk to each other and then ask for responses. Do get them to talk back to you, again within the confines of your presentation time. Do encourage questions, and it's up to you whether you take questions in the middle when you could be in full flow, or whether you ask people to wait to the end. If you're a novice to doing academic presentations, I would recommend that you ask people to save their questions to the end and you leave a couple of minutes to answer them rather than letting people interrupt you, as that can be a little bit distracting. Another technique is to give your audience a task to do. Again, this needs to be carefully managed, but giving your audiences an active task to do during the presentation makes them actively engage with your content in a much more memorable way than simply listening. A little bit now about visual aids for your presentation. Typically, this can be in the form of PowerPoint slides, for example, but if you're more comfortable with another visual tool, please feel free to use that. The same principles apply. Whatever you use must be a signpost to your talk. It's a summary of the points you're making, so keep it simple. If you're using a format like this, slides with bullet points, keep it fairly short, 4 to 5 bullet points per slide, one line per point that you're making. The audience needs to read fast and they need to relate what they're reading to what you're saying. So you can use the slides as an aid memoir for yourself, but also they help your audience to see the points you're making as well as hear the points you're making. You also use the slides as a framework for the presentation that you're making or the sentences that you're saying over the next couple of minutes. And my advice would be to minimize special effects, or preferably don't use them. They tend to be a distraction and they don't really add anything to the learning. There are exceptions, of course, so if you have a good reason for doing something flashy, by all means go ahead and do it. But remember that you don't want style over substance in your presentations. When you're delivering your presentation, remember to take your time and set some ground rules. Are you going to take questions during, or are you going to ask people to wait till the end? Do give the audience time to read each slide. There's really no point cramming a lot of information onto a slide that you skip over in 30 seconds and the audience doesn't have time to read it. You're much better to give them an arresting image instead of a lengthy quote, for example. They'll remember that much more than a series of text that they didn't have time to read. Try not to rush. This is difficult, but try not to rush. And talk to the audience, not the screen. A very common thing for students to do when they're delivering presentations in an academic venue is this. And you can see here that my sides are. Please don't do that. Your voice can't be heard if it's pointing backwards. We can't see your face. It's very difficult for the audience to engage if you're not looking them in the eye. A technique I use is I look to the back of the room and I talk to the people at the back. That means that you're giving everybody in the room the full benefit of your eye contact and they can hear your voice because you're pointing forwards. You can use notes, but please try not to do this. My talk is about the aspect of globalization. So make sure that if you have notes, they're really, you just glance at them, then look back up at your audience. Okay, so lots of further resources here. I like this website. There's lots of different things that you can look at on the Total Communicator website, and you can pick out things that are of particular use to you. And a reminder that the structured and unstructured journal examples on Padlet are here if you're working on your reflective writing. And finally, here's a link to criticalthinking.org, which again has a lot of different resources that help you with your critical thinking. Once again, thank you very much for listening, and I do hope this was helpful for you. Goodbye.